Representative Dan Christensen, thank you for being here. I'm going to go ahead and pass this off initially to Senator Schessler. Before I do that, though, I'd like to introduce to my right, this is Representative David Taylor and Drew Stokesbury that will be part of the panel for questions today. Senator Schessler.
Thank you, Leader Christensen. To my left is our caucus chair, Senator Randy Becker from the 2nd District. Senator Brown will be joining us when she returns from having made the Republican response to the event. I'd like to open it up with just a few brief comments before the questions. This is about as predictable as any State of the State speech. You know going in that this governor will always call for new and higher taxes. He's 6 for 6, heck of a batting average. The second thing is that the galleries will be filled with interest groups and appointees that agree with the governor, willing to applaud for almost anything. So that part of it was very, very predictable. The issue that was totally missing from today's events were the Hearst decision on exempt family wells. The one issue that the House has had 4-5 sessions now to deal with and nothing, and that this governor is known about for over a year, and to not even mention something that impacts families in all 39 counties, affordable housing, smart growth, was probably the only surprise or disappointment that came from the State of the State.
Let's go ahead and open it up for questions.
Can either of you or any of you talk a little bit about your concerns specifically with the carbon tax that's been proposed?
Yeah, and everybody should be concerned about it. When you run the numbers on it, you're looking at a 19 to 20 cent per gallon gas tax. You're looking at your heating and utility bills going up, your electricity bills going up. You're looking at food prices going up, manufacturing prices going up, delivery prices going up. And so while I appreciate the effort, and I've talked about this a little bit before, this is extremely tax heavy and policy short. If we're going to deal with the carbon issue, let's talk about the policies related to dealing with carbon more than we're talking about the taxes. And we're also talking about increasing taxes to the level that our middle class are the ones that are going to be hit absolutely the hardest on this. And so, yes, I think all of us here should have a tremendous amount of concern about this, regardless of your party affiliation or where you live, but especially if you're somebody who is kind of a middle to low income person, you're going to be hit absolutely horrifically hard by the proposal that the governor's put before us today.
Representative Christian, you
Yes.
mentioned last week that some of your members are working on an alternate proposal. What's the broad sweep of that? How does that differ from what we see today?
There's going to be a hearing on that bill. It'll be taking place, I believe it's in the Environment Committee. It's a pretty big piece of legislation, but again, it was put together by Democrats and Republicans from the House of Representatives. So it's got bipartisan support on it, and it is policy heavy, not tax heavy. And so I encourage you to look into the details of that, because it really deals with the issue of the carbon, not so much creating a new tax source that would be a depleting source of revenue that, of course, if the goal is to reduce carbon and you're going to tax carbon, as the carbon is reduced, you're going to run out of those resources someday. And then ultimately you've made government dependent upon a revenue source that's depleting. What are you going to tax next?
Is there any room in the governor's proposal to work with the governor and Democrats who support it to find a middle ground between your proposal and his proposal?
Well, I would say that so far we've only seen new and higher taxes from the governor in these proposals. And I think almost every carbon tax proposal or energy tax proposal I've seen, so we're going to tax your energy. And oh, by the way, if you reduce it, we're going to keep raising that tax. So you never get to declare victory. This is about new and higher taxes. It's not about fixing the problem. If you really want to fix a problem, we cap the amount of clean, renewable hydro energy that we can use in this state. We are not, this governor won't publicly talk about the option of small modular reactors. All sorts of other things, smart policies that could be done. This is simply about new and higher taxes, and you cannot win because it keeps going up.
If If I could just follow on to what the senator said, I agree with that completely. If the governor, I think, was serious about reducing carbon, he'd be willing to entertain the idea of offsetting other taxes for every dollar raised from the carbon tax. He's simply not willing to do that. He rejected out of hand a citizens' initiative a few years ago that would have done that. I think this is more about his desire to run for a higher office in 2020 and outdo what he thinks California does than to actually solve what he claims is the problem.
And I'd also like to tag on to that. In the governor's speech, he also talked about Puget Sound Energy and Microsoft already addressing things and making changes. So there's no need for a mandate. There's certainly no need for a new tax.
If you look at the use of hydropower, the server farms that operate in Grant County for our computer industry, internet industry, they advertise that they have carbon-free energy for those server farms in the Quincy area. But as Washington residents, we can't count every kilowatt of hydropower as green energy. Now, is there something wrong with Yahoo says hydro is green, and we have to say, well, only part of it is green? There's a real hypocrisy in how we treat hydropower, which is clean, affordable, and renewable.
Two final points on that. Number one, I think if you looked at the proposal we saw last year, you would recognize or see that the Democrats recognize that this is going to cause significant impact on families all across Washington. It included subsidies for low-income citizens. The other piece that nobody wants to talk about is a recent analysis that came out that said the nation is 24% below 2005 projections for emissions. Now, the governor and our friends across the aisle repeatedly say Washington is ahead of the curve for clean energy, low emissions, and the nation's already 24% below what they had projected for 2005. So it really makes us question really what this is about, and for many of us, this is about a tax increase and controlling people.
Couple questions. One, Inslee's carbon tax plan, it has a whole laundry list of things that the money is designated for. A lot of it is to trim, 50% goes to programs that trim carbon emissions, 35% goes to a lot of water and even irrigation stuff, and 15% goes to helping the poor defray energy costs.
Well, I think that's a really good question, John. And what it really means is you try to buy off people for now. You cannot bind a future legislature. You can spend the money on this now, but next biennium, it's a whole new legislature. If these programs, these rates aren't in the Constitution, they're good till the next legislature meets.
Okay, so are you saying that
Bait and switch.
Bait and switch, so why would anyone want to bait and switch? Sort of a common theme among the GOP is Inslee loves taxes.
Well, that's a fact.
Well,
It's a common theme among the Inslee.
But it's sort of like he loves taxes just because, ooh, I like taxes and doing the money. And he's going to be saying, I'm doing the taxes to help Washingtonians. So.
These are the same tired arguments that the lottery was going to fund education. The death tax was going to fund education. The Public Works Assistance Account was going to take care of infrastructure forever. You cannot bind a future legislature outside of the state's constitution.
Okay, so that makes about every bill that you pass worthless after 2 years.
I think this is also a lot about Inslee's almost pathological need to pick winners and losers. It's a theme that was first highlighted in the 2012 campaign, and every single action, virtually every single action he's taken since then, prove his detractors correct. Last year, he vetoed a manufacturing B&O tax cut that would have put all manufacturers across the entire state on the same playing field. He vetoed that, which left a series of different tax rates depending on which type of product you manufacture. And I think it's best explained if you understand that he wants to have that ability to pick who wins and who loses. And this tax plan, this carbon tax plan of his, is just another example in that. It's not money that goes to the operating budget that can fund schools or mental health or any of the other priorities he outlined, some of which we share with him. He's not willing to, like I mentioned a second ago, reduce other taxes and replace it with a tax on carbon. He wants a $1.5 billion slush fund that he can hand out to, Solyndra 2.0 based in Sequim, Washington, or wherever, so that he can continue to pick winners and losers for as long as he's governor. And I don't think that that's the right approach for Washington.
And I also want to add to that in the fact that when you go back to the Hearst decision, it is picking winners and losers. Any of the rural folks are the losers. The winners are the people in the urban areas. And when he had, in my mind, the audacity to say water for fish passage and aging water lines in the district and didn't mention what it does to the people in the rural areas, I just think that was absolutely criminal in my mind, that he is not addressing the needs of the rural people.
What rural people have
Rural
water lines and irrigation districts.
Rural people need wells. I happen to be one of them, and so do all my neighbors. And that is the topic in my area, and it's a topic around this state. It is a topic that held everything up last year, and yet he refers to fish passage and aging water lines. That's not appropriate here. We need to have him finally realize that this is the big issue, and he needs to address it.
You all have talked about not wanting to use the rainy day fund for any reserves that go toward McCleary. In general, can you talk about what a perfect solution would be? Would you prefer just to not touch any reserves and not address the court at all? Or would you prefer to use some sort of unrestricted reserves, maybe tax cuts, something like that? I mean, in a perfect world, if you had the reins.
I'm glad you mentioned tax cuts. The governor seldom mentions that subject.
Tax cuts, but rather budget.
Well, let's look about it. The Constitutional Rainy Day Fund is there for natural disasters and economic downturns. We haven't had either one. If we spend that prematurely and the inevitable slowdown in the economy comes, we don't have it. To rely on the constitutionally protected rainy day fund prematurely is very short-sighted thinking. What we do with our unrestricted balance within our 4-year balanced budget law is a perfectly logical conversation to have. We know we've got some resources we can utilize.
The governor talked about how healthy the state is. We have what's projected to be an additional $1 billion. There's absolutely no need to talk about taxes.
The other thing, too, that we only have to go back 10 years. 2007, we had a $2 billion surplus. At the time, it was the largest surplus in state history. The next budget cycle, we had a $9 billion deficit. $11 billion sway in one biennium. We did not have the type of rainy day funds or surpluses to deal with those types of things back then. We were talking about in 2007, what are we going to do with the extra $2 billion that came in? How are we going to spend it? Only to, within a year, see double-digit dips in the economy in 2008 in the building and construction sector, which were the foundation of our financial loss that we saw in Washington State. If we're going to continue to ignore history and make decisions based on what feels good today, what we think will look good tomorrow, what's going to get us through the next election cycle, then we're not doing right by the public. It's their money. They're counting on us to make good, long, sustainable decisions with how we spend their money. Not only where we spend it, but how we spend it. That we have enough in reserves, just like we hope every one of us, for emergencies, we have reserves, hopefully. Some of us live paycheck to paycheck. We've got a large sector of this population that live paycheck to paycheck. And when we're in a bad time, they're looking for government to be able to fill that gap. But when we're not being, good stewards of the dollars that the taxpayers have given to us to be stewards of, and we run into those big swells in the economy like we did in 2007, just 10 years ago. Come on, people, this is recent history. I'm not talking about 1929. This is 10 years ago. And we have, over the last century, gone through those recessionary cycles. And we have to know that that is a reality. There will be a correction at some point. And that's why we have protections related to the rainy day fund and our reserves to make sure that they're used properly. Not at a time when our economy is booming, we're one of the strongest economies in the country, as the governor alluded to, but at a time when we need that to help stand in the gap, fill that gap when times get tough.
So is there any urgency among you to resolve the problem that the court has asked you to resolve and fully fund the teacher portion in September 2018 instead of over 2 years?
I wouldn't say there's an urgency to it at this point in time. I think it's important to note a couple of things. Number one, Senator Schessler hit the nail on the head, and that is it's premature to lead with a budget that relies on the rainy day fund. The McCleary negotiators are already talking about what changes, if any, need to happen to the plan that was adopted last year in 2242, technical changes, clarifications, et cetera. And part of that process will look at whether additional key investments need to be made in different areas, special ed, school transportation, small school factor. At that point in time, when those decisions are made and those recommendations come forward, that's the appropriate time to look at whether additional money needs to go into K-12 in 2018 versus 2019. What the court's decision failed to recognize is 2242 included broad sweeping policy changes. It included additional money, it included new accounting, it included auditing provisions, it included new levy rates. Those all take time to be implemented, and what we heard going into 2017's session was, don't dump everything on us all at once, directly from the school districts. Every time that we force a change, it causes them problems. So what we came forward with as a legislature was an opportunity to not only begin implementation with some of the early funding, but allow the transition to occur.
That sounds like you're ignoring the court.
Well, my personal opinion is we ignore the court and thank them for their input. We have the fiduciary responsibility of the state of Washington. We have, as a constitutional provisions say, the legislature has the power of the purse. And if you did some real simple math, what you'd see is $100,000 a day is actually cheaper than $900 million.
Is that the opinion of the rest of you all too, that the court should be ignored more or less?
I'm not sure.
I have concerns that they're over bounds. Let's think about, we met the intent of the law, but where is our smartest investment in our kids? If we're going to make an additional investment in K-12, what is the smartest investment? Is it a one-time payment for salaries, or is it other areas? I think we are the body that writes the budget, and now that we've met the requirements, we should seriously consider what is the best investment in our kids and their schools.
And I think that when you look at what we're really talking about is, through an educational process, whether it's, just a K-12, technical colleges, or going on to a four-year college, all of that and everything that is structured under the K-12 design has been, in my eyes, a way to keep people out of poverty, to keep them out of needing the home, the support for homes, needing the additional government-supported entities. I think that what we did last year is something quite short of remarkable, and that we have an opportunity here that we didn't have before. And so give this a chance. Let the system that we've worked on actually do the job that it's intended to do, and that's to hopefully to save a lot of dollars on mental health issues, a lot of dollars on homelessness, etc. So
I'm sorry, Joe, if I could just follow on with what Rep. Taylor said. I was an attorney 2 days ago, and I will be in 59 days again. If I had a client who lost a $1 billion lawsuit and was told to pay the $1 billion immediately, or else pay $100,000 a day for the next year, it would be a violation of my ethical duties as an attorney to advise that client to pay the $1 billion right away when the court has given me a much cheaper alternative of $100,000 a day and then pay a much smaller amount at the end of the year. So I don't think it's that unreasonable at this point in time, based on what we know, what the court has said, to take the approach of the cheaper option to protect Washington taxpayers and continue to do what the court has said to do, which is set aside $100,000 a day.
But they've actually, in their latest ruling, implied or not implied, they said that there could be more sanctions beyond that $100,000 a day, which again, as we all know, is money that you're just kind of keeping on hold. It's not an actual fine. But so without knowing what those other actions are, is that responsible to do that?
Again, based on what we know, I think it's responsible. We're not talking about the difference between 999 million and $1 billion, where perhaps the threat might push the margin one way or the other. We're talking about a total of maybe 10 or $20 million versus $1 billion. There's a lot of leeway in between those two numbers, and based on what we have now, I don't think it's unreasonable to say, let's continue the course we're on, reserving the right to revisit it if we need to.
So you're not worried about, which is basically what the plaintiffs have asked for, is like shut down the schools, or threaten to shut down the schools if the mandate isn't met, or to toss out, toss out exemptions. I mean, are you basically calling the court's bluff that they won't
For what
do these more
purpose?
extreme?
We have made over $7 billion over the course of the last few years of new dollars going into K-12 education. All of our educators have seen massive raises. All of our our school employees have seen massive wage increases. We've got far more money by the thousands going to each student, in every class. We've got more money going in than we've ever had in K-12 education. Remember that this is the first time since the 1980s that we've got more than half of our budget going to K-12 alone. More than half. Matter of fact, it was only just a few years ago we were a little over 40%. And the other thing that's not taken into consideration, you talk about percentages, okay, that's a big percentage increase, but the budget grew substantially larger also. So it's not only a bigger percent of the budget, it's a bigger percent of a bigger budget. And so billions of new dollars have gone in there, and if the court is going to stand there and continue to put more sanctions on something where they already admitted it. They said, we have already met what they asked for. We just aren't doing it quick enough by 1 year. That's the bottom line here.
Only on one part.
On one part, yeah.
Is the Senate Republican caucus still committed to voting against the capital budget and bonds without a Hearst agreement?
We were pretty clear last year that the two were together because the capital budget provides a funding source for a compromise on Hearst. I go back to my opening statement. Isn't it incredible that an issue that big that's been out there this long and this governor never once mentioned it? 39 counties are impacted. Some severely, like Whatcom County with a complete moratorium. Counties desperate for jobs like Grays Harbor, and he never once mentioned it. So it is a really big issue. At least I think both bodies are having hearings and talking about it. First time in some cases, but this governor never once mentioned it.
How about the House caucus? Are House Republicans committed to voting against capital budget?
Let's remember that there's one vote that even with a slight majority you can't get. You have to have help from all sides of this building, and that is the bond vote. I mean, I think everybody here on this panel would agree that we worked together with the Democrats, with the governor's office, on what most of us would call a very good capital budget that affects virtually every corner of this state. Virtually all 39 counties are going to see some good results from a capital budget. The funding aspect of it, the bonds, is what's in question there because it takes that 60% vote to pass the bonds. There's a lot of, as the governor referred to, and I've heard over the course of the last few days from other Democrats talk about what's in the capital budget. There's low-income housing. There's things dealing with the opioid crisis. There's more beds out there to deal with, homelessness and opioid issues and drug addiction and all of that stuff. But guess what? The Hearst decision, when it comes to low-income housing, is something that is a reality in the rural parts of the state, too. Well, you've got in the capital budget, you've got a lot of money going into our urban communities with respect to those things. The Hearst decision is what is stymieing us. It's the Achilles heel when it comes to rural Washington and being able to provide affordable housing in the same neighborhoods that the capital budget's going to build a school. And if that isn't a direct tie, are we saying that we're only going to allow government to build buildings and build low-income housing and provide for the citizens? Why can't we allow citizens to provide for themselves? By the way, remember now, they're the ones who are paying the taxes that are paying for the capital budget. So let's not forget that aspect of it. David?
One of the things to keep in mind here with the capital budget is right now, the capital budget that was introduced last July had roughly $180 million worth of projects for urban water infrastructure. $180 million. We're arguing about what amounts to being about 4,000 wells annually across the state. 4,000 wells, and the ability to utilize those wells has held up a capital budget simply because there's people in this building who want to cater to special interests. We can solve this. This is a very simple solution to solve. This isn't a decision about water law. It's a Growth Management Act decision. And unfortunately, what this has evolved into is how much mitigation and how much money can we spend on all the other projects and not actually address the problem here. The problem, there isn't a problem. We're talking about less than 1% annual consumptive use across Washington state. Less than 1%. And yet at the same time, we have our urban areas that are continuing to grow, 12,000 plus units annually, without any regard to the amount of water that they are, just in Seattle, without any regard to the amount of water they're withdrawing, which is coming from the same basins that there are people that want to see those basins closed to rural water use.
So is the House Republican Caucus committed to voting against the capital bonding bill?
Yes. So one final point, too, that relates back to the governor's speech. At the very end, he sort of concluded by illustrating his two biggest accomplishments, or at least what he claims are his two biggest accomplishments in the legislature, which also coincide with my time here, and that's the transportation package and all the new funding to McCleary. The two notable things about those two big accomplishments are how much compromise and negotiation went in between both parties. For both the transportation budget and all the McCleary budget, Republicans got a lot of what we wanted, but we conceded things that we wouldn't have given up if we were in total control. The same thing was true for the Democrats. Yet suddenly now, because they have a one-vote majority in each chamber and down the hall, the Democrats suddenly think that they can pass a capital budget without any sort of bipartisan compromise, without listening to what Republicans want. Inslee thinks that he can get his way just by giving a big speech and saying we need to be bipartisan. Saying we need to be bipartisan is not bipartisan. What's bipartisan is reaching across the aisle, understanding what the people are asking for, understanding that they're representing their constituents who don't otherwise have much of a voice, and finding a way to meet in the middle where both sides get a little bit of what they wanted and perhaps give up a little bit of what they would not prefer to have given up.
Being bipartisan means putting your words into action.
One more question.
Is there support for the governor's plan on or suggestion for Dreamers, the college-bound scholarships? Ensuring funding for Dreamers even if DACA continues to stall in the federal government?
Well, I think the original tuition for students college-bound was, for in-state tuition was bipartisan. I don't think we've seen the bill yet or the budget cost to it. We really haven't seen those things. This is not one of those slam dunk no decisions, or yes, we have to see what the real policy and budget costs are.
History on that particular issue has been mixed. It's been a bipartisan thing. We've seen Republicans as sponsors of issues like this. We've seen Democrats as sponsors. All those bills have been co-sponsored in a bipartisan fashion over the years. And so a lot of it just comes down to ideological differences, geographical differences in some cases, agriculture versus not. And so I would have to say that is definitely not what I would call a hard partisan issue by no means.